In 1990, a lead opponent of a state lottery lost his re-election campaign. He was defeated by 158 votes. 1 year later, Texas had a state lottery. What happened? In 1991, the Texas lottery was sold to Texans as an easy way to fund government education. The promised windfalls never materialized. In fact, for most of the 1990s, the profits from the lottery didn't even go toward schools. This season of Exposed, we'll turn the pages of the untold story of the Texas lottery. We'll reveal how the promises that the lottery would fund education were hoaxes. We'll confront how trust in the Lottery Commission has cratered with lawmakers and the playing public after a $95 million jackpot was rigged with the help of the Lottery Commission itself. We'll examine the lottery's predatory nature. We'll explore how the agency that administers the game has a bad habit of going rogue, exposing Texans to more pernicious forms of gambling. Forms of gambling that make it easier for kids to get hooked and for cartels to clean their cash. And we'll tell the story of how the lottery died, only to be resurrected to pave a path for the ultimate boondoggle: casinos. Join us as we scratch the surface off the foil facade of million-dollar jackpots and pie-in-the-sky funding promises to reveal the destructive story beneath. From Texas Scorecard, I'm Daniel Greer, and this is Exposed, Gateway Drug.
Completely turned on its head what voters in 1991 could have contemplated when they approved the lottery in this state.
Some of the most serious problems America faces today are partially rooted in the truth that lotteries, which are a government program, have turned tens of millions of small earners who could be small savers into a nation of habitual gamblers.
And I don't think the state would lose a thing by just shutting them down.
How well do you remember the 1990s? What about Texas politics in those days? If you're like me, the answer is not very well. So let's rewind. In 1991, Texas was a different state politically. For one thing, a Democrat was still governor. But things were changing fast. Democrats, as they were in other southern states, were losing their grip on power. Governor Ann Richards won her race in 1990, but the margin of victory wasn't impressive. 4 years later, she lost to George W. Bush. No Democrat has been governor since. Around the same time, the Democrats saw a slew of defectors, including future state senator Phil Gramm and future state governor Rick Perry. Time was running out. Democrats had to move fast and use their fleeting power to pass initiatives quickly. They'd already reanimated gambling on horses in the 1980s. Now they wanted a state lottery.
Good evening, and welcome to the official Lotto Texas drawing for November 14th, 1992, as supervised by Lottery Security and certified by the independent accounting firm of Coopers & Lybrand. Tonight's Lotto Texas jackpot...
In the late 80s, lobbyists and lawmakers peddled a dreamy vision. They painted a world where government education could be funded without raising taxes. They told Texans the pathway was a lottery that would fund education without tax hikes. Texas wasn't unique in this regard. Everywhere the lottery was sold as a solution, it failed to live up to expectations. Texas was no exception. Here's Lon Burnham, a former member of the Texas State House.
Of course, the lottery was sold based on public school finance. And a lot of people were misled into thinking, it will have a major role in financing public schools. Well, that was a deceit right there.
The fight for a Texas lottery started years before its 1991 birthday. David Hudson, a Democrat representative from Tyler, served in the House from 1983 to 1989. In 87 and 89, he was the chief opponent of the lottery in the House. He characterized the pro-lottery push as a steady, growing drumbeat.
It was kind of a chronic or repeated issue, and every session that I was there, I'm not sure if it was talked about my first session, which would have been 83, I can't remember. But it just seemed to grow sort of exponentially as a topic.
The issue was repetitive because there was money to be made. Hudson frequently sparred in the press with fellow Democrat Ron Wilson, based in Dallas. over lottery legalization. Texas newspapers at the time carried statements from Wilson and Hudson jockeying for position. Lottery proposals passed the Senate in 1987 and 1989, but the Texas House killed them in both sessions. Hudson and his coalition prevailed. In 1990, Hudson lost his re-election bid. His absence left a void in the fight to oppose the lottery. There was another significant change that year. Ann Richards was elected governor, and bringing the lottery to Texas was one of her priorities.
Another big change was Ann Richards came onto the scene. I came in with Ann Richards, and she was a big proponent, and I think that put it over.
Richards was in the same boat as other Democrats in the South. She was living on borrowed electoral time. She was also faced with a budget shortfall. The combination of these two things is frequently cited as the reason for the frenzied approach to creating the lottery. Richards made establishing a lottery an emergency item for lawmakers during the 1991 session. That put it on a fast track. Still, she was trying to move a bill that had died twice. She deployed a tactic that gets recycled frequently. She shrouded legislating vice in virtue, making it about the kids. She didn't invent this tactic. She borrowed it from Lotto hype men in other states. The 1970s, 80s, and 90s were a lottery legalizing blitz nationwide. In Texas, education was the virtue shield to protect the vice. In places like Colorado, it was environmental programs. The effect is the same. Legalized vice is a turd in a tux. Jonathan Cohen, a historian of the American lottery, explains the phenomenon.
They try to make the cause synonymous with gambling. So, enact this proposition, this referendum, not because you want to gamble, but because you want to help school kids, or because you want to help public parks, or in Washington, D.C., it's for emergency services. So you want to help our police and fire departments. And it works.
The lottery was pitched as a voluntary form of revenue, a way for the state to fill its coffers without imposing additional taxes. Lawmakers should have known that this was a false bill of goods. Maybe they did. Here's Jonathan Cohen discussing what happened when New Jersey enacted its lottery.
Our state sort of realized that lotteries were not raising as much money as they thought, or they weren't able to sort of subsidize entire state budgets, which is what folks had initially hoped for, initially planned. We'll never have to pay any taxes again because we're going to have this lottery, or we can increase every social service fourfold thanks to this new lottery bonanza. And again, these are voters and policymakers who don't want to raise taxes, but also don't want to cut social services. And they have no other way to get money. And lo and behold, here comes this lottery, which to their minds is going to solve every problem under the sun that their states face. I think a lot of these lawmakers who enacted lotteries are just as prone to these wishful, hopeful, irrational beliefs about gambling.
Funding promises had already fallen through in other states. Still, the sales pitch worked on lawmakers and voters alike in Texas. But Will Hartnett, who voted against the measure, suggested it was about more than revenue for education. It was about taking care of a core constituency, government employees.
Well, there were a lot of vested interests that were pushing for a lottery. First, the Texas state employees that ultimately got the use of a lot of the lottery money. Secondly, the retailers that were going to sell the lottery tickets and, of course, win some of the prizes when they were paid out.
This matched with Mr. Hudson's perception of the legislation at the time.
I think it was driven by people who had an interest in promoting the lottery and perhaps benefiting from it financially. I never is a big word, but I do not recall public pressure to support the lottery. Nobody ever contacted me and said, gosh, this is a great thing. You ought to do it.
The public doesn't clamor for gambling. The vendors and their lobbyists are the drivers. The lottery, like the adoption of other gambling options, is a top-down effort. And what was done in Texas was commonly seen in other states. Speaking about the process of passing lottery legislation elsewhere, Jonathan Cohen points the finger at one vendor.
That Scientific Games writes the bills. They pay for folks to gather signatures. They pay for the advertising. And then they summarily, not coincidentally, win the contracts to provide lottery tickets to the state.
Governor Richards was so involved in the process that she went to the House and testified on the bill in committee. I asked Mr. Hartnett about that and what it might mean.
Never in 22 years did I see a governor testify in favor of a bill. That's pretty strong. Now, of course, the State Employees Union was a big campaign contributor, so that may have been part of the incentive.
Richards testifying stuck out as an anomaly. None of the governors who came after her have done this. Bush, Perry, or Abbott. David Hudson added,
And the same thing applies to Mark White and Bill Clements. In an earlier time, I don't recall governors doing that.
Even with her involvement, the opposition remained strong enough. During the regular session of the legislature, the proposed measure or bill still did not pass the House. He may not have been a state rep anymore, but David Hudson was still on the job. He organized opposition as a lobbyist for the Christian Life Coalition during the first few weeks of that regular session. Hudson left before the session was over to complete his law degree at Baylor. Still, the regular session ended with the bill being defeated again. David Hudson, who voted for his party's nominee in the general election of 1990, wasn't around to witness the special session, but he spoke with former colleagues about it.
There are people that were going to oppose the lottery, and Governor Richards changed their vote. Her personal lobby changed their vote.
Ann Richards wanted her lottery. She called lawmakers back to Austin and got what she wanted in a Hudson-free special session, a constitutional amendment to create a state lottery. Then it went to the voters for approval, and a few short months later, in November 1991, Texans went to the polls. The result? The amendment, Proposition 11, passed. 70% voted for it. Representative Hartnett, who was in the House in 1991 and voted against the lottery, said that the public was misled.
It was a bait and switch. The pitch for voting for the lottery was to inject new revenues into the public education system. That Governor Richards touted that many times, that the schools need it. And in reality, $200 million of the lottery was already spent before it passed in a rider to the budget bill, which is kind of unusual.
On May 29, 1992, the Texas Lottery sold its first ticket. The event was filmed for posterity. Governor Ann Richards made the purchase.
Y'all, this is really fun and really exciting. Okay, there you go. I mean, shouldn't we put this in a museum somewhere and like 30 years from now, someone else scratches it off?
The lottery did well in Texas, with record sales, but there were a couple of glaring problems. As mentioned earlier, from 1992, when the first ticket was sold, to 1997, proceeds from the sales went into the state's general fund, meaning the funds could be spent on anything. They weren't dedicated to education. And though record sales and revenue were generated for the state by the lottery, overall revenue didn't increase. The lottery is a shell game when it comes to government budgeting. The money generated supplants rather than supplements budgets. Essentially, lottery funds replace money already allocated to education from the general budget, freeing up those funds for other uses. This brings up the arguments used by lottery opponents when it was being created in the legislature. Here's David Hudson.
Some people seem to think that this was a religious issue, and I suppose I didn't like the lottery because for some religious reasons, but the main reason that I didn't like it was public policy.
There was a clear shift in the messaging in the press between 1987 and 1989. Pro-lottery forces applied a motivation to those pushing back against the lottery. Even though the pushback to the lottery was economic, the motivation assigned to the opposition was religious. Texans ultimately supported the lottery because they believed it would help kids, when in reality, it was helping the vendors, who win contracts with the state, and budget writers who don't have to contend with budget cuts.
When I came home, people would say, oh, well, we're going to pay for education with the lottery, and that's a reason to be for it. Or when it turned out that the lottery did not fund education, there was some resentment.
How are lottery funds allocated, you may ask? In September, the lottery announced profits of $8 billion in 2024. If you think of those profits as a pie, the lion's share, 75%, goes towards administering the lottery. Costs and prize payouts consumed the majority of the revenue. Approximately 55% went to prizes, 10% to administrative costs, and only about 35% was left over for the state. Of that portion, less than half was initially earmarked for education. In my interviews with lawmakers from the original era, the benefactors of the lottery became clear.
The only people who really benefit from legalized gambling, a lottery specifically, are the vendors who sell the products. They're the ones who go home with most of the money.
In 1994, Will Hartnett penned an editorial revealing that before the lottery had passed, the money had already been spent and wouldn't be going to kids. 25,000 new government positions had been created. Reminiscent of the spoils system from New York or the days of Ma and Pa Ferguson's, lottery revenue would go to political allies. Here's Mr. Hartnett.
Definitely a bone to the employees union. And then the lottery itself was not dedicated to any other purpose besides that. And I believe and have written that the vast bulk of the initial lottery money went towards the state employee pay raise and the hiring of 25,000 new state employees. So no, it didn't go where it was promised to go.
In 1997, facing growing criticism over the bait and switch, lawmakers passed a bill to officially dedicate lottery revenues to the Foundation School Fund, ostensibly ensuring that the money would support public education. Even after that allocation was codified, the amounts that the lottery is sending to fund education in the state are minuscule compared to the overall state budget, or even the funding for education. The total budget for public education that year was over $39 billion. The lottery this year will send education $1.98 billion. A comparison of that amount to the total budget means the lottery funds represent just 4% of the education budget. That brings us back to the beginning, 158 votes. It was uncanny that as long as David Hudson was around to fight the lottery, it failed. As soon as he was gone, it passed. He demurred when I made the suggestion.
Well, I would like for you to suggest that as long as I was there, the lottery would never pass. But had I been there in the summer of '91 when it did pass, I'm not sure how effective I would have been.
He's not wrong, but I think the observation that he was pivotal isn't incorrect. Of course, other people were working hard to stop the lottery. During our conversation, Hudson shared that he relied heavily on the Christian Life Coalition during his principled stand. There was Ann Richards on the other side. Whatever you think of her politics, she was a force, but she wasn't singular. Remember, the bill didn't pass during the regular session. It took a pressure cooker special session. The stand David Hudson was making was to keep Texas true to its roots.
Interestingly enough, besides the lottery, gambling is still disfavored in Texas. I'm sure there are people who'd love to build casinos here, but there's appears to be persistent opposition to those forms of gambling.
I asked Will Hartnett, who was a freshman lawmaker in 1991, if he remembered anyone taking Hudson's place, leading the opposition to gambling.
I don't recall. I was a brand new freshman, just learning the ropes. Nobody stands out.
David Hudson stood out. The early years of the Texas Lottery reveal a story of unmet promises that will lead to unintended consequences. While it was sold as a solution to education funding woes, the reality fell short. Where does this leave us? Fundamentally, we're left questioning whether the benefits of the lottery outweigh the costs. Senator Bob Hall left us with a poignant thought.
And I don't think the state would lose a thing by just shutting them down.
Join us next time as we tell the story of how an international gambling syndicate secured one of the largest jackpots in Texas history, and how the Lottery Commission, the agency tasked with refereeing the lottery, helped. Thank you for listening to this episode of Exposed. We'd like to thank Bob Hall, Will Hartnett, and David Hudson for participating in interviews featured in this podcast.
Exposed is a product of Texas Scorecard, the leading source on government and culture in Texas. For more information, go to texasscorecard.com.